Hello, and thank you for joining us at today's webinar, Corporate Social Responsibility, part of the 2021 Alumni Webinar Series. Before we get started, I want to turn things over briefly to Shannon Tim from the Wisconsin School of Business. Shannon?
Thanks, Jeremiah. If we could go to the next slide. My name is Shannon Tim. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at the Wisconsin School of Business. So it's great to be with all of you on our webinar today. I think today's topic on CSR is certainly one that continues to gain momentum over time. It actually reminds me of a conversation that Dean Samba recently had on our Badger Executive Talk series with Cheryl Stallworth about how people trust brands more than the government. And I think CSR certainly plays into why that might be the case. So I'm happy that we have Anne with us today to go in depth on this topic. We can go to the next slide. Before we get started, I wanted to share some other alumni opportunities that are coming up. So the university's Day of Giving will be on April 6th and 7th. You'll be receiving more information about that. Our next Badger Executive Talk that I just mentioned will be held on April 28th with Tom Falk, who is the former chairman of Kimberly-Clark. He and Dean Samba will be discussing leadership and present-day business challenges during that event. And then you'll see our upcoming webinars include one that was just added on design thinking, as well as navigating the digital landscape. So make sure that you register for those if you're interested. And then finally, for anyone who might be looking for a volunteer opportunity to give back, we just announced 2 student and alumni speed networking events. So these are fun and fast-paced events where you can connect with up to 6 students in an hour to share your knowledge and expertise with them and allow them to build their network. So I guess the best description is to think of these as kind of micro-mentoring opportunities. For more information on any of the opportunities that I just mentioned, you can visit wsb.wisc.edu/alumni. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jeremiah to get us started. Jeremiah, I think you might still be on mute.
Classic. Thanks, Shannon. Today's webinar is also brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development. CPED offers online and in-person programs and certificates that will give you the modern, relevant skills needed to advance in your career. All of our programs offer interactive learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations to provide customized professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on CPED, please visit our website at uwcped.org. Next slide. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask during today's webinar, you can submit those questions using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And you can expand or collapse the control panel using the orange arrow. We'll pose questions that are submitted during the Q&A at the end of today's webinar. I also want to mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to you along with the presentation in the coming days. And now we'll turn it over to Anne Turlock. Anne is a tenured professor at the Wisconsin School of Business. She joined the business school some 20 years ago, and at that time, her teaching was focused on business strategy. Yet, when corporate social responsibility moved from fringe to center, her focus shifted to teaching CSR, a shift that aligned well with her PhD in environmental science and management. In 2019, Anne was recognized for these teaching efforts when the Undergraduate Business Council awarded her the inaugural 2019 Professor of the Year Award. Anne is also a key player for several campus-spanning programs in CSR. She directs the Graduate Certificate in Business, Environment, and Social Responsibility, as well as Undergraduate Certificate in Sustainability. Besides her PhD in environmental science and management, Anne holds a BA and MS in economics. We're so honored to have you here today, Anne. I'll turn it on over to you.
All right, thanks, Jeremiah. Delighted to be here. Also, as I am delighted, I'm a bit bewildered because how do you present a topic as complex and fast evolving as CSR in just 45 minutes? I'll give it a try, and here's sort of what I thought we'd do. First, want to clarify what actually corporate social responsibility really is. How has it evolved over the years? Our understanding of it has evolved and has somewhat merged with corporate sustainability. I'm going to touch a little bit on that. Then I want to explain how I view CSR gone mainstream, how it's really become a business necessity, and why that is so. So touch on this changing business landscape that has made CSR a business necessity. Next posture, so what's a business going to do now that it is a necessity? How do we actually do CSR? How do we measure it? And then how do we communicate it? And then lastly, I want to sort of look ahead a little bit and talk about how there are efforts or a focus now on re-envisioning growth imperatives to make growth more inclusive and equitable. That's one of the postures there. And then the second posture, there is a looking forward, a trend for CSR to become actually a pre-competitive notion. So that's the agenda for today. Let's take it away. Let's see where we go here. What is CSR? So in the past, then, when first started the field, CSR really was just about business and society, so social issues management in a way. And it was very much underpinned by some moral belief systems. And so it's the study of moral belief systems and ethics, what would be right from an ethical perspective. So it was really normative. What should we do? On the other side, here, CS, so corporate sustainability, was sort of on the other side, looking at business and its overlap with the environment. That perspective or area was sort of underpinned by a systems perspective, and it was seen as environmental issues management. Systems perspective, with that I mean, we try to understand how is business embedded in its broader system and how is its response to this broader system driving how it relates to the environment and maybe overexploit natural resources. And so it was much more descriptive. This has merged. By now we think of CSR as CS or the other way around, if you will. So either of these perspectives really focuses not just on society or the environment, but on all three issues: business, society, and the environment. All right. And that is quite clear both in academia and in practice. So in academia here, those who conceptualize corporate social responsibility, it's quite clear they think of it to include commitments to both social and environmental practices, integration of social and environmental concerns. So it's not just the social side. And vice versa, if we think about, or if we look at how scholars conceptualize corporate sustainability, it is not just the environmental pillar that matters, but the social one as well as the economic one. Or it's about systematically assessing and managing the social and environmental performance of firms. So clearly that has merged. So this conception that CSR is just about the social responsibility of the firm is not quite right. It's about balancing economic, social, and environmental responsibility, both CSR and CS, corporate sustainability. All right. We look at in practice. Here's an example that nicely outlines how this convergence has also happened in practice. How do practitioners understand this? Here's the ISO 26000 social responsibility standard. Really, it's actually a guidance. Same, the ISO, so they provide these management systems, guidance, standards for quality management, environmental management. They have one for social responsibility as well. And what you'll see here, again, it's respect for society and the environment, not just the social point. In fact, they start using the term CSR or social responsibility interchangeably with sustainability. So that's from the CSR side. Here's an example from the sustainability side. So SASB, and I will come back to SASB throughout this presentation a number of times. SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. It's the equivalent to FASB in the financial world. So in the financial world, we have FASB. Here in the sustainability world, CSR world, we have SASB. What it is, it's a sustainability accounting and reporting framework. And I'm putting it up at this point here to show you. So this is a materiality map, so a map that companies use to decide what kind of issues should they be reporting on, and what you will find in the sustainability world. And what you will find, it's not just reporting on the environment, but it's reporting on social capital and human capital and so on. So really, these have merged. And I think I've made my point here, but I still want to throw up this particular quote. And this is because it's a quote out of an Accenture and UN Global Compact study. I'm putting it up at this point because while it's taken out of this sustainability study, and again, it references all three issues, environment, social, and corporate governance issues, I'm putting it up to explain a bit more about this study because I will be referring back to this study multiple times in the talk. It's a study that surveyed CEO attitudes, perceptions on corporate sustainability. It's done every 3 years. I'm referring back to data from 2019, and it's a very well done survey with there are multiple surveys. Each of these samples have 1,500 responses. So it's a well done survey that has pretty solid data. So just for you to know a little bit of the sample behind this, and it was surveying CEOs from large corporations, international corporations throughout the world, really, not just US corporations. Okay. One last item on how we understand CSR today before we then move on to the next pasture. The very latest development here is that we are no longer envisioning these three circles, which I believe many of you have probably seen when we think about sustainability. It's people, planet, profit, and the overlapping area of those three circles then is sustainability or CSR. We have rethought that conceptualization a little bit to now view it really and express it as a nested concept. So the idea here is a thriving economy or healthy businesses that is embedded in an equitable and just and stable society, which in turn is embedded, where's my mouse here, in a healthy planetary Earth support system. This nested concept, while it seems kind of little, so what we push the three circles on top of one another, is actually a really important one because it shows that we cannot have a healthy, thriving economy if it's embedded, or healthy, thriving businesses, if they're embedded in a society that is unstable because it's unequal, it's unjust, its wealth is distributed unequally to an extent that it just causes social tensions. So it's an interdependence of these three things. And we can't have a healthy society and stable and just society if we live on a planet where the planetary Earth support systems are overstressed and have become unstable. So it's that interdependence that's really important, and that we are trying to signify by nesting these three circles. Here are some quotes from Larry Fink. Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset management company. So he says questions of racial justice, economic inequality, or community engagement, we often think of them as S issues, social issues in the ESG conversation that we have. But you can't draw these clear lines between these categories. Climate change is already having a disproportionate impact on low-income communities around the world. So is it an environmental issue or a social issue? Clearly, they're interconnected. And we have to recognize these interdependencies a lot better than we have until now. All right, so that's broadly positioning CSR or corporate sustainability. And I too will be using these two terms interchangeably here, because really by now we use them to describe the same thing. Okay, let me move on to this idea of CSR gone mainstream. I want to kick off this segment here with a screenshot of the announcement, the 2019 announcement of the Business Roundtable. The Business Roundtable is an association of CEOs of leading US corporations. Collectively, these corporations have over $7 trillion in annual revenues. So it's not just the small club here. We are talking of a very powerful group. They employ over 15 million people, again, collectively, and pay like 290 billion or something in dividends. So huge influential group. 2019, they put out this statement to announce a move away from shareholder primacy towards stakeholder primacy, if you will. So no longer a singular focus on just the shareholders of these large corporations, but a shift away towards stakeholder primacy. So it's the commitment to lead those companies to the benefit of all stakeholders, not just the shareholders, in fact, listed last year in that little statement. So the question then is this statement the result of a broad shift in underlying moral belief systems, where these belief systems have fundamentally changed? And I don't think that's the full story. To be clear, there are some companies that are out there that are leading the field that have long had the stakeholder primacy as their focus. These include many privately held companies, so the poster children like Patagonia and some less known one as well. Some less known, whatever. Some companies are less well known. There we go. Like Cascade Engineering in Michigan, but also some large publicly held companies like Unilever under Paul Polman. They really put stakeholder primacy on there as their focus, or Interface back then with Ray Anderson in the mid-90s. They changed their focus, but those are really still the exceptions. And they were really driven by this underlying moral belief system that has changed. I don't think that's the full story, though. I don't think that's driving all of it here. Some might say it's the statement, it's a result of some overwhelmingly strong business case for CSR, so it pays to be green. Let's do CSR because it pays, essentially. But then really CSR really just becomes a vehicle for shareholder primacy again. And there are some opportunities for win-win for sure, and there is a business case in some instances, but I believe that too isn't the full story. I think it's really the result of changes in the landscape in which business operates that makes CSR simply central, a business necessity today. Let me touch on some of these on some of these pressures in the environment that have caused the shift in landscape. There's the investment community. And I keep on coming back here to Larry Fink just because it's a good example. It's a recent example of the investment community exerting that pressure. 2020, the letter to the CEO. So is a letter to the CEOs of the portfolio companies in which BlackRock invests. That letter back then, 2020, he stated famously, climate risk is investment risk, and you better disclose your climate risks to us as your investors. 21, most recent letter, much more strongly worded in expectation that companies do articulate and disclose how they put more of how they pursue this stakeholder primacy. So there are these expectation documents, such as these letters to CEOs that exert pressures. And then there's actually pressures that come from the shifts in actual capital allocation, right? This is a quote here from this latest 2021 letter outlining the magnitude in capital allocation shift here. So it's the actual shift in capital allocation in combination with pressures from such expectation documents. And there are some academic studies that these expectation documents, like letters to CEOs, actually do have an effect on these companies, and how they govern them and how they implement, or if they implement CSR. And then there's also, of course, other shareholder activism that exerts these pressures. So the investment community, we have workforce, right? It's a mind-boggling figure. By 2025, 75% of the workforce will be comprised of millennials. And these millennials have an attitude where they won't work for a company, or 64%, this particular figure here, won't work for a company that doesn't have a strong CSR commitment. And these numbers, depending on which survey you look at, might vary slightly, but the message is pretty loud and clear that millennials will prefer and even take pay cuts to work in a company with a strong CSR program or commitment to CSR. And as companies compete for that workforce pool, for that workforce talent, they need to step up. If anything, more recent surveys, the pandemic has further strengthened this trend. So we have the workforce exerting these pressures, or as part of the changed landscape. We have consumers clearly articulating that they would prefer purchasing from companies that have a CSR program, have addressed their impact on the environment, and have a positive impact on society. And also, as more and more millennials enter the workforce, they become a very important part of the consumer base, right? As they have income, and they then become the consumers. So millennials shop and buy products and services from entities that prioritize social causes that align with theirs. Again, doesn't matter which survey you look at, which source, the message there is clear. And I won't read all these slides out because you can all read yourself. So we're doing on time, good. Of course, question always is, there is these surveys. Whom would you buy from? Would you be willing to pay more for a company that has a stronger CSR program, and all these things? But then those surveys only tell part of the story, because what we really need to look at is also actual buying behavior. So does it translate into actual buying behaviors? I just pulled up an example here for 3 categories. The buying behavior here, this shows the weighted average of 3 categories. The 3 categories are chocolate, coffee, and bath products. The light green here is overall category sales growth. Dark green is the sustainable products sales growth. And what you can see is for chocolate, it's like more than fold the increase in sales if it is a sustainable product. For coffee, it is even positive growth versus negative for the overall category sales growth. Bath products, what, like 14 times. So clearly there is, it does translate to some extent, at least, into actual buying behaviors. Similar here, what this shows is sort of breaks it down a little bit for chocolate alone, the dollar percentage change, so that's sales here versus unit change. And what you can see is for chocolates with environmental claims, sales increased by 5 times, not quite 4 times, 5 times as much. Interestingly here, the absence of artificial ingredients, you might think the unit change is, there's no unit change, so they sold just as many units, but look at the dollar percentage change, showing that then, so to make sense of this suggests that they were willing to pay more, consumers are willing to pay more for these products here then, which makes sense because absence of artificial ingredients in part is simply you're willing to pay more because you're internalizing the benefit of these clean ingredients, supposedly healthier, since chocolate is actually healthy. Okay, I'm off topic here. All right, point here is buying behavior. We do see that it at least translates to some extent into the supermarket aisle. How do CEOs see it? This is the survey that I referred to or explained a little bit earlier. And what you will see, so the question here was over the next 5 years, which stakeholder group do you think will have the greatest impact on the way you as the CEO here manage sustainability? Well, it's consumers, it's employees. Of course, governments and regulators play a role as well because they set the larger system here, of course, within which business operates. Also, this question here is citizen trust will be critical to business competitiveness in my industry in the next 5 years. 76% of CEOs agree with this statement. So CEOs too view CSR as a business necessity by now. Before I move on to the next segment, let me show you one last thing that really nicely illustrates how the business landscape has changed. This is a annual assessment or a risk assessment done by the World Economic Forum, where world leaders both in the private and public sector assess risks to business based on both the likelihood, how likely is that risk to occur and disrupt your business, as well as the impact, how large would the impact be on the disruption of business. Here, look at that. 2021, of course, we have infectious diseases that popped out of not out of nowhere, but understandably so with the pandemic. The other ones, in terms of likelihood and impact, which are most likely and which have the largest impact, are all coded green here. These are all environmental risks. Coded red are what we call the social risk here, livelihood crises, social cohesion, erosion. So they've become clear risks to doing business in healthy economies. Interesting also how it has changed over the years. Look, 2012, economic risk in terms of likelihood were part of the top 5. Over the years, it has become more and more green. The likelihood of global risks disrupting business. This is 2021 again here. In terms of the impact, also the environmental and social risks have really moved up in ranks here, posing real business risks. Okay, so what is a business to do? Given that CSR has become a necessity, what do we do? And there is very clear agreement that it has gone way beyond by now way beyond environmental health and safety, like complying with these regulations. Clearly, that's not sufficient. And neither is just philanthropy. In fact, in part, if that's all a firm does, it's often seen of laundering a poor reputation or buying of anger. In fact, it can totally backfire if the philanthropic efforts are not even related to the main activity of the firm. So a firm that's in mining or extracting, if that firm's philanthropic efforts then focus on supporting the local Shakespeare Youth Theatre group, that's seen as really disingenuous. So we need to go beyond that. But what exactly do we do? And so the million-dollar question here, right? So the trend here has been from firm individual and very heterogeneous definitions and enactment of CSR, where each firm sort of decides by itself, all right, I'm going to do a little bit of philanthropy, and then I'm going to start recycling, and I'm also going to try to have more organic ingredients or whatever it is, right? To a more standardized, towards relying on accounting and reporting standards that then help the firm define and measure CSR. So looking to these accounting and reporting standards to help understand what is it that we're actually supposed to be doing here, or what we can do. And there are many of them. There's the GRI, there's CDP, ISO 26000, SASB, integrated reporting. So the good news is we have many of these accounting and reporting standards that can help firms figure out what to do. And the bad news is we have many of these standards that can help firms figure out what to do. And it's bad because they are not necessarily telling them the same story. They are not really converging yet. So such that you may be doing excellent CSR given one of these standards and really focusing on the main aspects here according to this particular standard, but then a different standard would not agree with that just because they define these things differently. Here's your standard soup. And these are, again, just a few. If you talk to practitioners, it is really, it's too many of them. It has not led to a unified procedure, but instead there's quite a bit of uncertainty for firms. What actually should they be doing here? And it's really saturation for saturation's sake. So there are these accounting standards and reporting frameworks. In addition, one thing before I just bash all of them, because that's not the case either. We have figured out a few things. So greenhouse gas protocol for corporate carbon accounting, that is a standard that has matured quite early, that is standardized worldwide, and where we actually know pretty well how to do corporate carbon accounting. So that's one we got in our pocket. There are these accounting and reporting standards that some firms use. Another example where they that can guide firms to figure out what should we be doing in terms of CSR are frameworks like, for example, the B impact assessment. This ultimately is an assessment that if you score is at a certain level, you can apply to have the B certified label on you. But underlying this actually is this assessment framework, and I give you a screenshot of a sample question that can help firms figure out in what areas can they be, do they need to be active to perform well on CSR, or to even implement CSR, to even figure out what it is. What should they be doing? So there are frameworks like this available. Because a lot of these accounting standards in sustainability and reporting standards don't always ask about the same things. And even if they do ask about the same things, don't ask firms to measure them in the same way. There is a real lack of convergence when it then comes to ranking, if you will, CSR performance of firms. Okay, so we have looked at, do these social responsibility indices or ratings do they actually correlate so that the same firms appear at the top for all the different ratings that are based on the different frameworks quite often, or design their own methodology for assessing CSR. Turns out they actually don't correlate very well at all. Different studies, same idea. There are these rankings in different publications. Are they consistent, these rankings? Not at all. On pigs and Teslas that fly, here are some of my favorites. Halliburton made the Dow Jones Sustainability Index when pigs fly, right? Some of you may know Halliburton. It's an oil field service provider, a large one that was implicated in the 2010 Deepwater Horizon explosion. Yet it's on the sustainability index, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. Tesla is ranked the highest for the car makers, and that's the Morgan Stanley index here. But in a different index, it's ranked worst. Its saving grace, I will say, is at least Teslas do fly, right? So here's Starman, I think he was called, circling the orbit, or orbiting the Earth. All right. The most recent development here is an effort among these standards to align with one another. So what we really need is one standard, one sustainability accounting and reporting standard that is consistent, that allows comparability across firms then, and that gives clear guidance to firms. What is it actually that they need to do for good CSR or CS performance? These standards that are out there, again, here you can see a few have been sort of jockeying to be the dominant standard, and I think that it's a statement from September 2020. They've recently decided, rather than engaging in the standard war to become the equivalent to FASB, like the one accepted standard, they might be better off sort of aligning with one another and trying to explain to audiences how they actually complement one another. This really is still in process and sort of unfolding as we speak almost. So there is no clear, that it hasn't sorted itself out yet. Let's put it that way. Okay, let me move on. So with these frameworks, accounting and reporting frameworks, giving firms a sense of what it is that CSR entails and what they need to do, question then is, once they've done it, how do they communicate it, right? There are, for investors, they would probably look at the firm's CSR reports, or even the SEC does require a disclosure of climate change related risks. So you might find it in some of the financial reports as well. So investors will look at those reports, but what about end consumers? You know, how do we communicate with them? And there, for the past, we have relied heavily on product labels, and we have 456 of them, which of course at that point they become useless. People are logoed out. The system of 400 logos is just not a winning strategy, right? To clearly communicate to your customers what you're undertaking in CSR. So the trend here really has become a movement to communicate using brands and maybe certify on the firm level as opposed to the product level. So using brands to communicate. The issue here is real estate on a product label is really limited. And how do you put on all these labels that it's fair labor, organic ingredients, that the product is carbon neutral because you bought lots of offsets and something else, right? 4 or 5 different labels. There's not enough space given other requirements that you need to also disclose other information per the FDA, like nutritional information and whatnot, ingredients. Can't tell the story. So instead, we tell the story. We try to tell the story via brands. So Organic Valley, it's a local example here, right? who is trying to tell the story of this individual independent farms that they support, family-owned farms, organic, all of this complicated story in a way via their brand that they have established. And the idea here is it's somewhat credible to do that because you put your brand name up as collateral. So in these certification systems, it's a third-party certifier that says, yep, you're good, you get this certification to whatever, be fair trade or organic, carbon neutral, whatever it is. We don't have these third-party certifiers, obviously, for the brands when we communicate through them, but the brand name is what's the collateral here that we put up. It's expensive to establish a brand name, and you don't mess that up by not truthfully telling the story here then. There's also a move towards firm level certification, and rather than product level is the point here. You may have seen certified B corporations. This is one of the better known firm level certifications in the US. So it certifies on the firm level the firm's CSR activities and performance. To become certified, there are a couple of things. This assessment that I showed you early on, I showed you like a survey question from the B impact assessment. You need to score a certain score on that assessment to be eligible for certification, and you also need to reincorporate, if you already incorporated, as a benefit corporation. So, you remember how I said, how on earth do I do this in just like 45 minutes? It's a big topic area. So benefit corporations, if we have time towards the end, we can talk about them a little bit more. But so this certification is a firm level one, assessing both the certifying CSR performance, and then also requiring actually reincorporation as a benefit corporation. So you can see it's been around for a while, but we only have 3,800 firms that have picked it up thus far. And those are worldwide. B-Lab being the nonprofit that's behind this whole effort. All right, what's next? I want to start with the segment on rethinking growth. So from an environmental perspective, there's been this idea of rethinking growth for quite some time by now. And one camp there is about decoupling economic growth from natural resource use, right? That's about then closed loop systems, so ideas that we borrow from industrial ecology, where we can afford, or the idea is still that we pursue economic growth, but we decouple it from the use of natural resources. That's one camp that kind of looks at rethinking growth from an environmental perspective. The other camp there are more aligns from the other camp in the environmental perspective, more aligns with Greta Thunberg and her notion of these fairy tales of eternal economic growth, where it's simply this notion of, wait, we will not be able to fully decouple to the extent that we need to, given the stress on the natural resource system that we have today. It would be way too late by the time we accomplish this. Plus, it's not even clear that we can accomplish it. So really what we need to save our planet here is degrowth. Developed nations need to stop growing to give room for the developing nations to still grow, because they still need to economically develop. Aligned with that idea a little bit, because it gets at ideas of more equitable growth, but on the global level. So aligned with that idea are thoughts or notions from the camps that think about growth and rethinking growth with more of some social goals in mind from the social perspective. And here it's about rethinking growth to become more equitable and inclusive. Here is again the study that I mentioned earlier that asks CEOs how they see it. This quote, "Unleashed capitalism has created extreme poverty, terrible social conditions, and a difficult situation for our planet. If we don't manage a better social transition to wealth, we will be in trouble." Maybe less eloquently said, but same idea is this quote. This is from an entrepreneur who immigrated to Denmark. He was a son of immigrants. Huge success and very wealthy person. He says wealth is like manure, spread it and it makes everything grow, or pile it up and it stinks. Importantly, this inequity in growth often falls along racial lines. So this graph here, you can see household net worth over the years. Top line is white. The gray line here is for Black families. Huge gap in wealth. And of course, that creates it. Okay, let me step back. Next slide on for that one. And CEOs agree. 88% of CEOs believe that the economic system needs to refocus on equitable growth. And that has increased tremendously over the last year. So again, this survey is done every 3 years, and there has been a real change in attitude and beliefs with respect to equitable, inclusive growth. Of course, it's not only morally wrong, and you can even make the business case. So if we look at studies looking on the business level, we find that those that have rank higher on gender and ethnic diversity outperform those that rank very low on gender and ethnic diversity. So you can make a business case for it. It's economically, so on the national level, it's damaging. There's an amazing figure here. The Citigroup did a 2020 study. If we close the gaps, the key racial gaps for Blacks, wages, education, housing, and investments, if we close them today, we could add $5 trillion to the US GDP over the next 5 years. So besides it being morally wrong, there's an economic case to be made to refocus on inclusive and equitable growth. So on the national level, then, there are efforts to re-envision the GDP, right? The World Economic Forum proposes embedding GDP into a dashboard where we take into account inequality, energy use, public health, similar to the European Central Bank. So as an economist, we actually don't care as much about the amount of money circulating in the economy, but people's well-being in a broader sense. Even if we have some important growth in GDP, if the gain of that goes to just 1% of society or the population, then the overall wellness of society it doesn't speak at all to the overall wellness of society, if you will. US Bureau of Economic Analysis, look at this. Of course, we have the GDP as the most important indicators. That's a screenshot I took a couple of weeks ago. We now have indicators for distribution of personal wealth and economic well-being and growth. So we are rethinking GDP. Let me speed up. I will take one more minute before we open it up for questions. I want to go, this was the national level. Let's go to the private sector initiatives. There are philanthropic efforts like the Center for Inclusive Growth from MasterCard. This is a quote here from the president. And it goes back to this idea that these concepts are nested. The success of the company is linked, inextricably linked to the well-being of communities and countries, the path to shared prosperity that benefits us all. We can't have a thriving business if it's embedded in an unequal, unjust society. So there are these private sector initiatives, philanthropic, and then of course it's also on the business level, the actual implementation of CSR. Now, we have had these measures with respect to hiring practices and promotion practices for a while, and I don't think they have done enough. They clearly haven't done enough. It hasn't become more equitable, the situation. It has become less equitable. So what I think where we are going here is to have additional measures and activities that more fundamentally address the systemic barriers to diversity and equitable growth. There are some, and that's almost my last slide here, some examples of firms that sort of guide the way here. This example is Cascade Engineering. They have programs, Welfare to Career Returning Citizen programs, where they simply don't ask about criminal history in application forms, and have had huge success hiring intensely loyal and productive members that were incarcerated previously and now are on a career path. Cascade Engineering has these returning citizen programs, as have Coca-Cola, Starbucks, etc. Still not enough, clearly, but I think so. When I think about what's going to change in the CSR area here, I think it's going towards implementing these measures that more fundamentally address these systemic barriers to inclusive and equitable growth there. All right, I want to open it up to questions, really. I did have CSR as a pre-competitive notion as a second area of sort of future debate here, but I think I'd rather open it up, and if there's more time, I could always go back to this second pasture if there are no questions.
Thank you,
All right,
Anne.
Jeremiah, you go somewhere.
Yeah, so with that, we'll open it up for questions. Again, you can submit your questions using the chat box on the sidebar, and you can expand or collapse that sidebar using the orange arrow. So, Anne, I had a question. So, some voices really push the business case for CSR. That is, it pays to be green or good. Do you agree with that statement? And is there any consensus in the academic community regarding that?
So sometimes, does it pay to be green or good? Sometimes. Actually, as an economist, I should probably say, as a trained economist, it depends, which is like the always right answer as an economist. So there are opportunities for win-win. I think over the years, they have become less readily available because we have sort of picked the low-hanging fruit by now. And then it really does depend. Are you end consumer facing? What is the industry that you're in? What's the regulatory environment that you're in? Stepping back a little bit, and then that gets to the academic studies. It also depends on what do you think about? How do you think about does it pay to be green or good? Are we looking at short-term gains or longer-term values? So in academia, what we see is the short-term payoffs are not necessarily there. It's very mixed, the results, because upfront costs are often high to undertaking CSR initiatives. Longer term, and when we look at, and all these studies that have these mixed results also often use shorter term accounting measures, return on investment or something like that. Longer term measures that look at actually the firm's market value, there is some consensus where it does pay to be good or green, where we have more consistent results that those that are good or green have higher market values. Of course, that's in part also because those that are good or green are often also the better managed companies with better management capabilities. So, and that then reflects in their market value. So that's a semi-long answer to your short question.
Thanks, Anne. You also had mentioned that benefit corporations are not without problems. So, what is problematic about them, or do you still think that benefit corporations as a concept do more good than harm?
So, I brought it up in the context of talking about certified B Corps. And I explained that to have that firm level certification, you need to have a certain score on this assessment that assesses your CSR performance, and you need to reincorporate as a benefit corporation. So you usually incorporate as a C Corp, S Corp, whatever. When you incorporate as a company, you pick form of incorporation, right? Benefit corporation is a new legal structure that is actually, there are about 38 states in the US that have adopted that legislation where you are allowed to or able to incorporate as a benefit corporation. And in your articles of incorporation, the idea is you state as purpose of the company a public benefit, so that you are then technically obliged to not only pursue shareholder maximization, but also pursue this idea of maximizing the public benefit that you stated. Okay. Now, the problem here is that for large publicly traded companies that already exist, to reincorporate as a benefit corporation, that requires a 2/3 shareholder vote, and it's complicated. It's not clear that they can easily do that. So in a way, it's not available to these large publicly traded companies that then, as a result, can't also get the certification because they cannot be, it's difficult for them to be benefit corporations. So they can't get this signal of maybe doing good things in CSR, because again, they cannot reincorporate as a benefit corporation easily. And even though they may vastly outperform benefit corporations in terms of the actual CSR performance. The other problem with benefit corporations is that if we have this form, a benefit corporation, there's like an implicit idea that if we need a benefit corporation, does that then mean that C Corps cannot be good? So if we need benefit corporations to allow companies to be good, there's an implication that as a result, or an implication that C Corps clearly cannot be good. And that's just not true. As a C corporation, you could put anything into your articles of incorporation. You could also state that you want to pursue a public benefit. There's nothing that prohibits that. C corporation only indicates that the company gets taxed separately from the owners. It's like a tax status. So there's this misconception that gets created where it gives like a almost convenient excuse for C corps to not do good because they can't, since they're a C corp. That's sort of implicit in that idea there. So that's my beef with benefit corporations. I think overall they probably still do more good than bad, but we got to be aware of the drawbacks here.
Makes sense. We have time for about one more question here. So at this point, corporate social responsibility reporting is pretty much voluntary. Do you think it should be a requirement, or what would be the downsides to making it a requirement?
So it's pretty much voluntary. The SEC does require, again, disclosure of climate change related risks, but broader CSR reporting is entirely voluntary. In South Africa, if you want to be on on the stock exchange, it's required to report. Denmark as well for certain companies. So we have some examples where it is required. I think it's a bad idea to require it until we have an agreed upon standardized way to account for and report social responsibility, corporate sustainability. And we are still working on that. And also a whole body of assurance providers, because we need to assure these reports, right? Similar in the financial world. And some of the risk here then is, of course, once we do this, they're similar with financial reporting, right? It sort of encourages a shift of focus on the things that we can measure and fix short term, where we have quick payoffs, right? Because we got to keep reporting, as opposed to maybe allow the company to address issues that take longer to pay off, or where improvements only show up later and down the road. and that can really be problematic, the shift towards the quick short-term solution, short-term thinking that might occur if we require this kind of reporting. But we've managed more or less. We are working with that in the financial sector, so presumably we can also figure that out for the sustainability sector at some point. All right, what's timing here? We are right on one.
Right on time. So Anne, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to everyone who joined us. Later this week, you'll receive a link to the survey where you can provide feedback on today's webinar. We'll also provide a link to view the recording of today's webinar. For more information about the alumni services provided by the Wisconsin School of Business, or to sign up for future alumni webinars, please visit us online at wsb.wisc.edu/alumni. Again, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.